quite frankly, it was designed to facilitate a lot of spin by the government and then to bore the pants off people after that to the point at which people would lose the will to live. And I think my point is this, Count Corla. The real democracy was happening out on the streets on Saturday in Dublin, when 20,000 people came out on the street in what is one of the biggest demonstrations we've seen in recent years. Workers, students, pensioners, people with disabilities, people from all over the country, because frankly, they're sick of this government, they're sick of the spin, they're sick of the propaganda, when they know the reality is that they are facing an utterly disastrous cost of living and housing crisis. And they didn't believe for 1 minute that this government was serious about addressing it. And when you look beyond the spin and when the dust settles, it will be absolutely clear to all of those people and many, many more who marched at the weekend that they need to get out on the streets again. And plans are already underway for the next national demonstration on the cost of living and housing crisis on November the 12th. And I would confidently predict that it will be bigger again than the protests we saw on Saturday, because it is clear that the government is interested in spin. But what we actually got in this budget is not a giveaway, is not a bonanza, except maybe for the big corporations, the energy companies and the wealthy, but for ordinary people we got a few sticking plasters on the gaping wound that is the housing and homelessness crisis and the cost of living crisis, but those sticking plasters will not stop the bleeding, the hardship and the suffering of the cost of living and housing crisis that is blighting the lives of tens and tens of thousands of working people, of pensioners, of students and of the vulnerable in our society. The net fact about this budget, when you unravel the spin, is that the vast majority of people will be worse off in the next year than they were last year. That's the reality. A €12 increase in pensions and social welfare payments against what would be necessary to protect people just against the rising cost of living based on the real level of inflation, which is about €27 a week. Not to gain anything, but just not to lose. Not to be driven further into poverty. So the government of energy companies and others who are benefiting and exploiting the cost of living crisis. That is the reality. As I pointed out in the pre-budget debate, the CSO estimate that in order not to live in poverty, you need about €287 a week. So that means anybody who is solely dependent on a state pension or a state welfare payment is by definition living in poverty, and this government should, particularly against the background of this cost of living and housing crisis, at the very minimum, have lifted people out of poverty, the most vulnerable people, but they have not. When you take it in the round, the people who needed help are going to be worse off next year than they were this year. Or if you take, for example, a fairly average worker earning between 25 and 30,000 euro in the government's own budget book will gain €4 extra a week. €4, right? Against a background where in real terms, when you look at energy bills, most likely will have trebled by the end of this year. And with the cost of basic goods, milk, bread, food items and so on, and the increases in rent and other costs of living, have probably lost, one estimate is between €4,000 and €5,000 as a result of the cost of living crisis. and they're going to get €4 extra as a result of the tax changes the government have made. And even if you're earning slightly more than that, 40,000 or a little bit more, €16 a week. A total drop in the ocean compared to the crucifying increases in the cost of living, the rising energy cost, the cost of heating your home, the cost of paying your rent, the cost of paying childcare, the cost of paying fees, and all the other costs that are crucifying people. And the truth of this will become apparent, because you see, in the end, you can't hide the reality of what is actually in people's pockets. So a few one-off payments. I mean, the one thing I will say is that the government changed the arithmetic over the weekend, probably in response to the scale of the protest, where some of the once-off payments that we'd heard about increased literally over the weekend. So the protest put them under pressure, and they were forced to increase the once-off payments that they're going to give in the months before Christmas, because they suddenly understood the scale of the anger and frustration and hardship when they saw those people on the streets. But people will not be fooled by one-off payments. And the problem is that you failed, and in fact you are not willing as a government to deal with the underlying problem, the root cause of the cost of living and housing crisis, and that is the rampant profiteering of energy companies, of corporate landlords, and of big corporations. You don't want to address that. So many of the billions that you're going to give out in once-off payments will go into the pockets of people and then straight out again into the coffers of the energy companies. And on top of that, some of the big winners will also get new subsidies. The energy supports that have been given for business are significantly higher than the proportion that has been given to ordinary householders. Significantly higher. And from what I can see, unless the minister is going to disagree with me, there is no threshold or limit on the amount of profits that can be made from the business recipients of the energy supports. I mean, surely data centres, for example, should be excluded from the energy supports when they're sucking massive amounts out of the energy system. But if they can claim that their energy costs have increased, they're going to get more subsidies, when they are part of the problem in terms of the energy price hikes that we are suffering. When I look at the fuel allowance, for example, okay, some increase, and I welcome that, in the number of people who will be eligible for the fuel allowance, but huge numbers will still not be. 80,000 people more eligible. Any reasonable estimate of those who are suffering energy poverty would have required eligibility for the fuel allowance to increase by at least about 300,000 people. For example, pensioners who have a little bit of an extra pension, as well as the state pension, are excluded from fuel allowance. And looking from the figures here, it looks as if they are not going to benefit, and many others who need the help, the ongoing help of the fuel allowance, will not get that support. Windfall tax, a promise, but no actual windfall tax on the energy companies. We'll wait for Europe to maybe figure it out, and we'll introduce it at some time in the future. But in the here and now, no windfall tax on the super profits being enjoyed by the energy companies. No caps on the charges that they are inflicting on people, on the massive hikes in prices they are inflicting. You're going to continue to let energy companies that have seen record profit spikes over the last year to continue to profiteer at the expense of ordinary people. Quite frankly, it's nauseating. It's nauseating when what was necessary is to cap the prices at which they are charging people for heating and electricity in their homes, and indeed to take that sector under public control and to run it on a not-for-profit basis, when what we are witnessing is spectacular profiteering and market failure of the privatised market of energy. Then there's housing. I mean, really, I just can't believe what's happened in housing. You see, you get the real budget when you look at the book of estimates. If you listen to Minister McGrath's speech, you would think there was huge additional resources and all sorts of new measures to deal with what is an absolute housing catastrophe. But then you go and look at the estimates book. The actual money allocated, it's exactly the same as last year. 3.6 billion in 2022, 3.6 billion in 2023, the same. Now, oh my God, how could you possibly allocate the same money as you allocated last year to deal with a housing crisis that has got exponentially worse, when the government's own plan has failed to meet its targets, when the number of people in homelessness has increased by 30%, when rents have gone up more and more, and yet you allocate the same amount of money? It's absolutely unbelievable. A slight increase in the money going to the homeless, but it's only 10% when the number of people who are actually homeless has gone up 30%. That means more misery for families that are being evicted at the moment, and we're seeing a major spike in families who are being evicted because they can't afford rents that are being charged out there. The HAP limits that are being given to support them are too low, and of course, and this is critical, and I really want to highlight this point because nobody has mentioned it yet, because of the government's failure for years to raise the social housing income thresholds, we have seen the culling of thousands and thousands of working people from the social housing list. That's now going to get worse after the budget, because the people who got some increases as a result of the adjustments of the bands are now going to see slight, very slight, increases in their net take-home pay, and as a result, they will be thrown off the housing list. And they will be denied eligibility for social housing. It's going to worsen the situation for many people. I had people phoning me up this week actually saying, I hope I don't get any additional money off the government in the budget because I'll be thrown off the housing list. And that's the truth. Because that is a massive stealth cut that the government have been deliberately perpetrating for several years now, where we've gone from a situation where a few years ago 47% of households were entitled to social housing or social housing support. Now that is down to 33%, and that will be further reduced, and the government refused even to publish the review on the social housing income thresholds that they have had on their desk since the end of December of last year, and indeed a review that has been going on for about 5 years. The vacant homes tax, well, that's just a joke. 3 times the level of the property tax for property speculators sitting on empty and derelict properties are not even going to be included in the vacant homes tax. And then empty homes, there's a whole series of derogations, but in any event, even if they are identified as vacant homes that are vacant without good reason, it will be about €1,000 a year on average. That's not going to make any difference to these vulture funds, these investment funds who are sitting on property watching the value of it clock up. They don't give a damn because they're making far more on the capital gain of that property rising in value, and they have no intention, unless they can make super profits, of renting it out to the people who really need assistance in the housing crisis. Nothing in the budget for those affected by the defective housing, by the failure in building standards and fire control standards. Tens of thousands of people facing enormous costs or simply unable to remedy their houses because of the costs involved that were built during the Celtic Tiger. Nothing at all in the budget. The concrete levy that the government sort of celebrated in the budget speeches earlier on will actually simply add to the cost, the already unaffordable cost of housing. The rent credit, well, I mean, again, it's just pathetic. €500 credit for some renters. And again, I want to highlight this point. If you're in receipt of HAP, you're not getting that rent credit, even though you are paying top-ups. Everybody in my area who gets HAP is paying a top-up over and above the differential rent. I had a working family in with me the other day who are paying €1,000 top-up, as well as the €200 they're paying to the council, and they will not get the renters' credit. That's a month, by the way, and the renters' credit is 500 over the course of the whole year when people are paying rents of 2,000, 2,500 a month from these racketeering corporate landlords. And then there's a few other things that haven't come out, or at least need to be clarified, because again, the estimates book is a good book to read. You get the detail. Incredibly, the Environment, Climate and Communications budget has been cut by 17%. Cut by 17%. And the Greens have allowed this to happen. Quite extraordinary. Go and look at the book, the estimates book, the expenditure report. 17% cut in the environment and climate portfolio. And it would seem that the biggest reduction, although I've seen the department tweeting since we put this out there, saying, oh, this isn't true, but it's here in front of me, for energy transformation, minus 35%. That's the main line item that's down. And the total expenditure change adjustment for the department, minus 17% in the estimates book. If you have it there, Minister, you might have a look at it, because if you don't know about that, you really should. It's absolutely shocking. The Department of Arts has also seen an 8% cut in its allocation, and although some people in the under its remit will see some minor increases in funding, the music and entertainment sector have been texting me over the last hour or two saying nothing for them. Nothing. Despite lobbying, despite producing a very good pre-budget submission, apparently cross-party support from Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil and so on, in actuality, nothing for that sector. And overall, the Department of Arts, Culture and Heritage, an 8% cut in the overall budget. In transport, we've seen only a 2% increase in the transport budget. Which is really pathetic. If we're serious about cutting the cost of living and simultaneously trying to address climate change by encouraging people to make greater use of public transport, we needed a dramatic cut, if not the abolition, of fares, but we also needed massive capital investment in the expansion of the bus fleet and the public transport infrastructure to accommodate more people. But we have an absolutely miserable, derisory 2% increase in that budget. In the area of health, we have a 5.8% increase in the overall allocation, but that is less than the level of inflation. Significantly less. And when you consider that the big issue in our health service are the waiting lists, the catastrophe and ED departments, all linked critically to the issue of recruitment and retention of staff, the inability of the health service to recruit and retain the health professionals, the nurses and all the other allied health professionals necessary to provide a decent healthcare system, a system that is failing people disastrously because of the lack of resources and staff. We get a below the inflation level increase in the budget for the health service. If you take the waiting list plan to deal with waiting lists, last year there was 350 allocated to deal with the waiting lists, and the consultants are now saying that plan, which was supposed to reduce waiting lists by 132,000, will actually result at the end of this year in there being 20,000 more people, not 132,000 less, but 20,000 more on waiting lists than there was at the beginning of this year. So the small increase in the health budget is destined not to actually address that waiting list scandal, where huge numbers of people who are sick and need a surgery and other treatment are waiting for years and years and years on waiting lists. Education, yes, we welcome primary schools books being free. We've been proposing it for many years, but only primary school, but not for secondary school, when the cost for secondary school students' books and other costs indeed are very considerable, and no abolition or no funding to provide free books for secondary school students. Or critically, I mean, you've reduced the student-staff ratio somewhat, but what is that going to do to deal with the inability to recruit and retain teachers, particularly in Dublin, which is linked in turn to your failure to address the housing crisis? Teachers do not want to work in Dublin, the big urban centres, because they can't afford to live here, because they can't afford the rents and the house prices, so they're not willing to work in our schools. So where are you going to get the teachers if you fail, as you have, to deal with the housing crisis? Similarly, in higher education, yes, 500 reduction in fees, but people still paying €2,500 in fees. In reality, there should be no fees for access to higher education, none whatsoever. And they will continue to pay them, but again, many people can't even stay in college and are now deferring or giving up their places in college because they cannot afford the accommodation costs in Dublin and the major urban centres. And all the student unions are reporting that record numbers of students are not taking up their places because they cannot afford the cost of accommodation, and the government has failed to provide affordable student accommodation to our students. The Minister mentioned an increase in the PhD stipend, but it's absolutely pathetic. An extra €500 a year, which still means that brings it up for those PhD and research students who get a stipend, and many don't, bringing it up to 19,000, but it's still below the level of the minimum wage. So people who are doing PhD in research, which when we need these people, you know, the government always talking about it, an innovation economy, how we need more skilled and trained people, but actually huge numbers of people doing doctorates, PhDs, postgrads and so on are living in absolute poverty. This is not going to do anything other than scratch the surface. Not even that. It's cosmetic and will make no difference to the poverty that many of those research and PhD students are suffering. Last few points I want to make is, if you like, the big elephant in the room in all of this. You see, well, as I mentioned earlier on, the single earner earning between €25,000 and €35,000 is going to get €4 extra per week, right, against the background of an absolutely catastrophic cost of living crisis, where the cost of living has increased in real terms by about €4,000 or €5,000 that they've lost in real terms, in terms of their income and the cost of living. It barely scratches the surface. But the tax breaks for the super wealthy executives are going to be continued. So the Special Assignee Relief Programme, a tax break only to given to people who earn more than €100,000 is going to continue. So if you're a super wealthy executive not remotely affected by the housing crisis or the cost of living crisis, you get a special tax break all of your own. That's right. It's absolutely obscene. Scandalous. And that speaks to a far more general giveaway in what I like to call the shadow budget. The budget that's never really talked about, the tax breaks for the big corporations and the rich, which are absolutely extraordinary. I mean, we are hearing that there has been a €5 billion bounce in corporate tax receipts in the last year. Now, that can only happen if there is a massive increase in the level of corporate profits. Between 2012 and 2020, corporate profits went from €74 billion to €193 billion. But in the two recent years, it looks, based on the corporate tax receipts for 2021 and 2022, that there may have been as much as a 25 to 30% increase in corporate profits in this country. That's right. Absolutely creaming it. But the government doesn't want to take any extra money off these people. They don't want to take any extra money off the real estate investment trusts, who, according to the government's own figures, have seen their profits treble in the last 4 years, from 7 billion to 20 billion. They don't want to raise any additional tax revenue from the landlords who own multiple properties. No increase in the taxes on those people. When you look at the list of other corporate tax breaks in revenues tables, they're absolutely incredible. There's a tax loophole, if you want, in the revenue tables, which is called intra-group transactions. This is where the big corporations shift money from one subsidiary they own to another subsidiary. In 2019, there was 16 billion in tax relief given to subsidiaries shifting profits from one subsidiary to another. In 2020, that figure went to 35 billion. I mean, it's eye-watering stuff. And we don't know what it is for 2021 and 2022. That's the real budget behind the spin. The real budget is that this government protects the profiteers in the energy companies, in the big multinational corporations, the property investors and vulture funds, while ordinary people are crucified, but you try and hypnotise them with a few sprinkles of dust, which in reality are just a few thimblefuls of water thrown at a raging fire of a housing and cost of living crisis that is gobbling up the income of working people who are struggling, seriously struggling, to deal with the cost of living crisis. But listen, the people won't be fooled. They'll be back out in the streets in a few weeks when the dust has settled, when the spin has stopped, and the harsh reality that despite record revenues being available to this government to address the cost of living crisis and the housing crisis, and the fact that we had a report this week showing we are the third richest country in the world. Isn't that amazing? We have one of the worst housing crises in Europe. We have the highest cost of living pretty much anywhere in Europe, and we're the third richest country, but the vast majority of ordinary people are suffering because the priorities of Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael and tragically the Greens are to protect the winners from this crisis and inflict all the hardship and misery on working people, on students, on pensioners and the vulnerable in our society.